We're going to go ahead and dive into the last 4 hours. It won't be 4 hours. The last blocks of instruction for today. I'm Joe Boys, the Director of Government Partnerships for SBP. Why am I talking to you about long-term recovery groups? By way of background, I worked for a long time in local government, also managed disaster recovery efforts in the state of South Carolina, helped to establish many long-term recovery groups for disaster responses for several different hurricanes over the past 8 years or so. So I'm going to talk to you today about creating effective and productive long-term recovery groups. And I'm going to have to hang out by the computer because I want to be able to see my slides and not look at myself on the screen. So now I'm being pigeonholed up here, but that's okay. We'll make it work. So this is the agenda of what we're going to cover today, this afternoon. I'm going to talk a bit about the anatomy of a disaster, kind of what happens whenever you have a disaster that reaches the level of having multiple different types of federal declarations, what types of resources and challenges are available to you throughout the various phases of that. Then we're going to talk about building a recovery strategy, which ultimately leads into creating a long-term recovery group, figuring out how you're going to pay for the activities of that long-term recovery group, and then we're going to end the day with some common pitfalls that we've seen through our work across the nation, so that you can avoid making the same mistakes that other groups have made while trying to navigate what, if you haven't already figured out, is an incredibly complex process under very dire circumstances. So figuring out ways to navigate that and avoid some of those common pitfalls is very important. So first we'll talk about the anatomy of a disaster. We're going to walk through what it looks like. This is the recovery continuum. You see we have over here on the left-hand side the National Response Framework that covers preparedness and your short-term response leading into your intermediate recovery. And then we have our National Disaster Recovery Framework, which basically covers the entire gamut once you have your disaster event, which takes place there. Now, as Americans, we've generally done a very, very good job of preparing for disasters. We typically provide a lot of resources to local emergency management, state emergency management, federal emergency management to train and prepare for every inevitable event. These are the type of activities where one time a year your governor will meet with a bunch of folks and they'll do some sort of tabletop exercise and the media will come out and everybody will pat each other on the back and say we're ready for something to happen. Then you'll actually have an event take place, and that's where your clock kind of starts here on this timeline right here. We have our disaster takes place, and as a country we've gotten a lot better over the years in dealing with the short-term response. So this is whenever you're really working to protect life and property in the immediate aftermath of some disaster event. If you look back historically, when disasters happen, loss of life tends to be a much higher number. In the past, we've done a better job of moving people out of harm's way, leading up to and in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. But once we move beyond that initial response phase into the recovery phase, as a country, pretty much we have failed in almost every recovery that's ever taken place since a lot of federal resources have been made available. So we're going to talk through the challenges and the resources that are made available to you in each of these various phases. You'll see for short-term response, I have assigned an incredibly arbitrary time frame of 1 to day 30 for this because, as I'm sure you've experienced, some of this stuff ends up rolling well past the first month mark, but it just seemed like a pretty good point to cut it off at. But in what we'll call the short-term response phase, some of your challenges that you're going to face are your initial search and rescue activities, your restoration of critical lifelines. So FEMA uses the lifeline approach that has basically 8 different sectors, and it says if any of these sectors are disrupted, you're going to have a major disruption to the community. Therefore, we have to work as efficiently as possible to restore these critical lifelines so we can resume some sense of normalcy. Oftentimes, you're going to have major debris removal operations taking place. A major challenge that you face in the short-term response phase, which oftentimes bleeds into even the intermediate recovery phase, is sheltering. It's very, very easy to get shelters open. It's pretty easy to get folks in them, But for those of you who have worked in sheltering, it's incredibly hard to get people back out of those shelters, particularly if you have situations where you may have had a high unsheltered population prior to the disaster. They'll oftentimes treat emergency shelters as permanent housing. So finding places for those folks to go can be a bit challenging. And during the short-term response phase, you'll begin the process of assessing the damage to your particular community. Now, some resources that you have available to you, which we'll talk about in more detail, and we've talked about a fair amount today. FEMA may make available public assistance and or individual assistance. And I want to take a second to talk about kind of the levels of disasters. So everything I'm talking about here today is in the context of a disaster that reaches the level of a major declaration where you have both public assistance and individual assistance available to you. As we've all seen, there are disasters that happen every day that never reach that level. You may have a small tornado or a small fire that wipes out 5 to 10 properties in a particular community. While that's a major disaster for those impacted families, the purpose of the disaster recovery framework is to basically set parameters for when additional resources are required. So ideally, the local community will have the resources to address a disaster of that scale. In the event that that's not the case, then you have a situation where state resources will come in to assist those disaster-impacted citizens. And in the event that it reaches above that, that's whenever you'll have a federal disaster declaration where the state says, we don't have the resources or the capability to be able to handle this on our own internally. We need access to the federal resources that are available to us through the Stafford Act. So one of the resources that are typically made available from a federal perspective are what's known as the FEMA Mass Care services. Typically, they are made available leading up to a disaster event taking place if you know it's coming. But some of those services include sheltering, providing food, distribution of emergency supplies, support for service animals, individuals with disabilities, providing mass evacuee support, as well as reunification services in the event that children and adults become separated. Let's talk briefly about public assistance. We've talked a lot about individual assistance, which provides funding directly to disaster-impacted individuals. Public assistance basically provides funding from FEMA to governments or eligible nonprofits that are providing a public service to do two different types of work, which are broken into emergency work as well as permanent work. Emergency work has to be completed within the first 6 months, and permanent work has to be completed within the first 18 months after the disaster declaration. The two major categories for emergency work are Category A, which is debris removal, and then you have Category B, which is emergency protective measures. So those include the pre-positioning of supplies, any sort of sheltering, medical care, the costs to operate your emergency operations centers. And these costs, emergency work costs for the I think about the first 60 days after a disaster are 100% covered by the federal government. After that, there's typically a cost share which ranges anywhere from 75% federal, 25% local to 90-10. Permanent work has a cost share associated with it, and it's basically repair to major infrastructure that are public facilities broken out across those different categories C through G. Depending on the scale of the disaster, the cost share may be 90% federal, 10% state or local government requirement, but the minimum, or the other option is that it's 75% federal and 25% for the state or local government to cover that cost. So once we've moved out of that short-term response phase, we now move into what we call short-term recovery, which the time frame here is not quite as arbitrary for a cutoff. It's day 31 to day 180. And the reason why it's day 180 is because after day 180, pretty much all of your federal resources that are available to you are not going to be involved in the process on the boots on the ground type perspective, unless there are some extraordinary circumstances that make them stick around. But some of those challenges that still remain, you're likely still going to be involved with debris removal, and at this point, you're reaching a situation where you're running out of places to take your debris. So planning for what to do with a large amount of debris is critical at this point. You're still trying to get those folks whose homes may have been damaged or destroyed into some sort of temporary housing solution. And then at this point, you really need to be working towards maximizing the FEMA individual assistance applications submitted, as well as funding received for all of your disaster impacted survivors, because that's going to dictate how much money in the event that HUD provides CDBG-DR funding to you that your community will receive, because they base it on those FEMA individual assistance numbers. But the resources available to you, you still have FEMA PA and IA. You have SBA loans, which we'll talk about a bit more. You may have some state or local funding. You're going to have your volunteers, your volunteer organizations active in the disaster, your long-term recovery groups. And this is around the time whenever the philanthropic donations really start coming into play. If you have a very large-scale disaster, you're going to end up getting money from a lot of different places. Figuring out how to best utilize those funds is a critical function of the long-term recovery group, as we'll talk about a little later on. I'm not going to go into great detail. Yes, sir.
Just my understanding, you said from day 31 to 180. Does that start at 31? Is that how this is?
Not necessarily. That the day 31 part is completely arbitrary. As I say, you may still be having some response type activities take place, but the day 180, that's whenever Stafford Act says FEMA's done from a major perspective here in your community. So basically from day 180 until the inevitable release of HUD CDBG-DR funding, there are no more federal resources being made directly available to you, which is the point of the cutoff at day 180 there. So Claire talked a lot about FEMA individual assistance. I'm not going to go into this, but this provides direct funding to your disaster impacted individuals to make repairs to their homes or provide funding for them to have somewhere to stay, basically, or replace some of their goods. Claire talked a lot about IA appeals. I will say that it's incredibly important that you're encouraging everyone in your community to appeal their decision. They have 60 days after receiving an award or receiving their approval or denial letter to appeal it. And we have appeals assistance, but you need to reach out to Claire because we're not doing it actively in California, but she's willing to help you on a case-by-case basis. What we've seen is about a 66% increase in the total FEMA award amount for those who we've helped.
Even more, actually.
And it's even better now. I have old data. Claire's out there killing it day in and day out. So what's the number now?
So we had a 50 to 60% approval rating on our appeals, given disasters and appeal types. And for approved appeals, it's up to 80% increase in award amounts.
So that's a lot of money being potentially left on the table for your disaster impacted survivors. And I like to always say that, you know, a lot of people look to FEMA to come in and solve all their problems, but really it's a situation where you're kind of putting a Band-Aid on a bullet hole. You're really just trying to get a start towards some sense of normalcy. It's not meant to make you whole, but get you somewhere decent. So who defines that can vary depending on who it is that you're working with. So it's incredibly critical that your citizens are appealing those awards.
Can you go back one slide? That phone number isn't our helpline number.
That's our phone number.
Oh, so that's deceiving then, sorry.
It is, I think it is our phone number, isn't it?
Hotline, that is not FEMA's hotline.
FEMA Appeal Help Hotline. I left out the word appeal. I'll be sure to add that in there. It's the SBP FEMA appeal. Yeah, if Claire hadn't gone into this whole thing about how we're not actively working here, I would have done a lot more to make that clear, but I was kind of glazing over that portion there, but thank you for pointing that out. That's why you notice I didn't say the phone number, right?
She's still awake.
You passed the test. Well done. So here are the three major categories of SBA resources made available during the short-term recovery phase. You have your physical damage loans, which are basically what we've been talking about most of the day. That's the loans that are provided directly to disaster-impacted homeowners to make repairs to their physical assets. There's also a mitigation assistance loan that can complement the physical damage loan, which is basically expanded funding to allow you to make improvements to protect against future disasters. So this will be funding to do things like fortify your roof or elevate your home if you're in the flood zone. Things like that that are basically mitigating against future disasters. There are also economic injury disaster loans, which provide funding to cover financial obligations for businesses that have been impacted by the disaster. And you can also use it to cover your operating expenses as well. Here are some important deadlines, which many have passed for the particular disaster of which we are here today. The IA deadline is typically 60 days after your disaster declaration, as is the SBA Home and Business Physical Loan Program. Economic injury loans can be applied for up to 9 months after your declaration. And then those FEMA public assistance requests are due 30 days after the declaration. Now, think about the chaos that's happening up to the first month after you have a disaster declared. That's a lot of work that folks have to do to make sure that you're getting all that documentation collected so that you have the potential to receive funding for those public assistance projects. So it's definitely a very chaotic time frame for the officials who are involved in that process. So we move from the short-term recovery into intermediate recovery. And this is kind of the area where we as a country have kind of dropped the ball. There are really no federal resources made available to you from day 180 to best case scenario a year after. What we found with most HUD, Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery programs, they're really not up and running until about 600 to 700 days after the disaster. So this is an awfully long time where you're leaning on the state and local funding as well as your volunteer organizations and your long-term recovery groups to have some sense of progress towards your recovery. You still have the challenge of temporary housing available most times. Oftentimes, given the size of a disaster, enough housing stock is impacted that you just don't have enough suitable housing available to house everyone in your community. So figuring out a solution there is a challenge. You're working now towards housing repairs, your infrastructure repairs, and trying to get the business community back to some sense of normalcy as well. So we're going to talk about long-term recovery groups. And a long-term recovery group is basically a cooperative body made up of representatives from the community. They can be faith-based folks, nonprofit, the government, business, and basically working to assist individuals as they recover from the disaster. And the key point I'll make here is that your success hinges on having an active recovery champion. Someone has to be a single point of coordination and the face of the long-term recovery group, because otherwise it gets incredibly hard to coordinate all of the resources. People don't know who is in charge of what, and you end up with chaos and confusion. Along those same lines, your major resource for actually getting work done during the intermediate phase are going to be your volunteer organizations that are active in the disaster. It's very, very important to coordinate their efforts within the community so that you avoid duplication of efforts. You don't want to have a crew of Mennonites showing up at a house that some of the Team Rubicon's already working on. So having somebody who's coordinating those VOAD activities during the recovery process is critical. And you want to be providing support to those VOADs, or they will quickly move on to the next disaster. We were in Kentucky back in October of last year. Kentucky had some major flooding in July, and we were there for a week. And as we got there, this was a couple days after Hurricane Ian hit Florida. And while we were rolling in, there were tons and tons of contractors rolling out to head from Kentucky down to Fort Myers, because they're always chasing the next thing. If you're not making an environment that is conducive to success for both your volunteer organizations as well as your for-profit and nonprofit builders, they're going to move on somewhere where it's a lot easier for them to have a bigger impact. So coordination is key. Now, once we've kind of struggled through that intermediate recovery phase, we enter the long-term recovery phase, which can take anywhere from year 1 to year 7. The reason why I cut it off at year 7 is because HUD says that grantees are supposed to have all their funds expended within 6 years of getting a grant agreement in place. With that being said, there are still active community development block grant disaster recovery funds that date back to September 11th, 2001. There are still a ton of open grants that date back to Katrina and Rita in 2005 for Louisiana, Mississippi, that area. All the Hurricane Sandy grants are still open from 2013. So that year 7, that's if you're successful in executing your recovery. That's a really optimistic time frame. It can last 10, 15, 20 years to actually fully recover the community. And they may never fully recover in some situations. So we're going to talk for a second about the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. Any CDBG-DR activities have to be conducted in a presidentially declared county. That's either FEMA public assistance or individual assistance. They have to have a direct or indirect tie back to the disaster, and they have to meet a national objective. There are 3 national objectives for CDBG-DR funds. The major national objective is benefit to the low to moderate income community. 70% of all CDBG-DR funds have to provide a benefit to the low to moderate income community. That's defined as having an income that is 80% or below the area median income for the county in which they reside. The other national objective that can be used is the elimination of slum and blight, which just requires a local government to designate an area as slum and blighted, and then they can use those resources there. That's often used for situations where you're doing some economic revitalization activity or trying to provide resources to your business community that's been impacted. The third national objective is what's known as urgent need. So it's kind of a catch-all for everything else that doesn't fall within those other 2 national objectives. And where it gets really, really tricky with CDBG-DR funding is that you have to account for duplication of benefits. So FEMA's going to come in very, very shortly after the disaster takes place and put a lot of money on the street to a lot of different folks. They're likely not going to hang on to that paperwork that was associated with that check. In the event that they were not fully recovered with that limited funding that FEMA provided, they will need to prove that they used those funds for their intended purpose so that they can receive the full value of CDBG-DR funding that they may need in the future. I say all that to say it's very, very important that you're telling your disaster-impacted survivors to maintain records of everything they receive from FEMA, because at some point they need to show that this funding was received for this purpose and I used it for that. I worked for the government managing a DR grant, CDBG-DR grant, and received a database from FEMA that said how much money people received. Hopefully it's gotten better since then, but we didn't have the specificity that said it was received for this particular purpose. We knew they received this amount in IHP funding, and we had to assume all of it was for the structure unless they could prove otherwise. So keeping a copy of that award letter that breaks down what the funding is for may be critical for receiving the full value of resources that they need to get fully recovered. So, yes.
One other red flag in the state of California for CDBG-DR is if you're a survivor and you qualify for that funding, you're not allowed to go with a voluntary organization to do your rebuild because of the Davis-Bacon Fair Labor Act of like 1932 or whatever. Sadly, in California, you have to offer a prevailing wage. Well, it's voluntary work and there is no exemption. In the state of California, anywhere else you go, you can be rebuild with that.
Yeah, and that's, I think it's 1936, but for Davis-Bacon. Yeah, but no, so, and that's a programmatic decision that it may be state law, but so when you're developing program guidelines for the organization that administers the CDBG-DR funds, which has historically been I think the California Office of Housing and Community Development, just like Susan Naramura, something like that. Yeah, so that can be challenging, and that's really a programmatic decision that they have to make to decide that they're going to provide funds, because you could still track the labor even if you're using volunteers. And single-family housing is actually exempt from the Davis-Bacon Act in the context of a CDBG-DR program, if the executing organization decides to follow that. They have that exemption, the waiver in the Federal Register notice. So now we'll talk a bit about building a recovery strategy. So, a few truths to disaster recovery. Most people are going to recover themselves. I say that to say you really need to be cognizant of how you are going to coordinate your limited resources. There are some folks who won't be able to recover on their own. So those are people who don't have the money to recover. They're more socially vulnerable. Those who may be elderly, those who have a disability, or those who have children, young children in the home. It's kind of hard to put up drywall when you got to keep eyes on a toddler running about, right? So you really want to make sure that you're focusing your resources on those who can't help themselves. And this isn't really my two don'ts, but the guy that was referenced earlier, my boss, he has two don'ts of disaster recovery. Don't rebuild the house of a high-income person. He likes to say we shouldn't be rebuilding Bill Gates' house, or we shouldn't be rebuilding Mark Zuckerberg's house. When I usually give this presentation, it's not in a county where he may have set foot at one point or another. So this is a bit unique for me. And the second point is don't reinforce a slumlord, because you're just kind of exacerbating the problem there.
Before you move on,
Yes.
on your incomes, you use the term low and moderate, and then you use high income folks. What's your range? What numbers are you talking about?
So when I talk about,
Yeah, we live in Silicon Valley.
yeah, so low income for here is a little different than low income for Hazard, Kentucky, I'd say. But using the federal standard, low income would be 80% or below the area median income. High income, using the federal standard, would be 120% or above the area median income. Now, that kind of leads to a big problem. Let's think about maybe the firefighter who's married to the school teacher. You know, they both have decent jobs, but they have a tremendous amount of savings in the event that their whole house is wiped out and for whatever reason they didn't have flood insurance. So there's kind of a huge gap there. Go ahead.
So a low-income individual in Santa Clara County is $96,000, very different than Hazard, Kentucky, and a four-person household would be making $137,100. They have to be at that level or below.
And then we have low income, yeah.
Yeah, that's high. I'm trying to be poor over here. I say that, and then I spent like $20 on a sandwich last night that should have been $8, but that's okay. So here are some major buckets of funding available to resource recovery, and this is a bit of a rehash from the last block there, but you have your FEMA IA, your FEMA PA, you got your CDBG-DR funding, you've got your National Flood Insurance Program funding, you got your SBA funding, you're going to have your state funding, and you'll see this little small block down here is typically going to be private funding and donations. So it's going to be your smallest resource most likely, but it's going to be your most critical. And I want to highlight once again that this FEMA individual assistance block directly correlates to this HUD CDBG-DR block. And in the context of HUD CDBG-DR, you are competing with every other disaster impacted community within a given disaster year. So Congress is going to allocate X billions of dollars for all disasters that took place in 2023. If we use 2022 as an example, they allocated $3 billion, and we had major disaster declarations in Kentucky. We had major disaster declaration in Florida. We had it in Puerto Rico. There was one in California. So getting funding allocated is strictly just based on taking the entire universe of those FEMA applicants for those major disaster declarations and doing a proportional allocation based on the number of FEMA IA applicants, the damages that were received, and the funding that was provided. So having a more accurate picture of actual need from those FEMA individual assistance numbers is critical to maximizing the amount of CDBG-DR funding that your community will receive. If you don't remember anything else about what I talk about today, that's the most important part. So when we're developing our recovery strategy, here are a few questions we want to ask ourselves. Do we have a purpose? And that's generally pretty straightforward. We have a purpose of trying to get our community recovered. Do we have the money to work towards a recovery? Do we have generally good people? And when I say good people, what I'm meaning is folks who are working towards a common goal, folks who are working towards getting our community recovered. And then we have to ask ourselves, what happens if we don't recover? I don't see that being a major challenge here because there are a lot of financial resources available, but in a lot of major disasters that we see, it's already kind of economically distressed communities, and it's very, very easy for folks to just pick up and go somewhere else than it is try to rebuild somewhere where there's not a lot of opportunity. So disasters tend to exacerbate that problem in most scenarios.
Can I correct that statement? We do not have, well, disaster strikes our least wealthy communities. And yes, we're sitting in Santa Clara County, but farm workers, that was our two last declarations. And
Well, good. Then let me talk about my, that's great, that's good to know. So then, so what tends to happen there is that what we call the disaster swirl. So you have places that have kind of a distressed tax base, and you hit by a disaster, and then you have people having to make the decision: am I going to fund the fire department, or am I going to fund an effort to clean out the ditches? So typically, you're going to fund the resource that people are going to complain about the most if it goes unfunded, which then leads to more problems down the road. And when you get impacted by a disaster, oftentimes those people who have the resources are going to tend to go somewhere else rather than wait around for months and years to have the community fully recovered. As more people leave, you have even less tax resources to be able to fund your government. So you end up in this swirl of never being able to recover because folks just pick up and go. And that happens a lot when you have migrant communities as well. It can be exacerbated there too. So, why do so many disaster recoveries fail? As I said at the beginning, we have open disaster recovery grants that date back over 20 years. There have been a handful in the history of CDBG-DR that have actually finished on time. You have folks who are still out of their homes, almost 20 years after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. Why are they failing? Yes, yeah, so there are a few kind of common failure points that we've identified. It really kind of revolves around a lack of leadership and a lack of coordination. In the first instance, we don't use the same terminology, so this can be an incredibly confusing, complex process to get recovered, right? If I say DOB, what does that mean? What's DOB? B as in Bravo, yeah. Delta Oscar Bravo. So somebody said date of birth, right? But what is DOB in the context of the Stafford Act? Duplication of benefits, right? So not having the same terminology, having a 300-page guidebook to navigate the individual assistance program. In this line of work, we're all too often really quick to go acronym heavy, and I'm going to be guilty of it the whole time I'm talking today. So not having the same terminology can lead to failure because you have misunderstandings. We don't have a common process for what it is that we're trying to do. We haven't appropriately organized our resources for success. That's both personnel as well as financial and materialistic resources. And we don't have a plan for what success looks like. These are some common failure points that we've seen. So, conversely, what we've seen, most successful organizations have a common terminology. They use a standard methodology for their processes. They all have a plan that they're following, and they all have an aligned common purpose, which is to recover the community. So working to build the four commons will help to have success in the context of a long-term recovery group. So it's your responsibility as the leader of your recovery effort to provide those four commons. And now I'm going to show you an example of kind of a common process housing flow. It leads from the outreach, which is a disaster case management function, figure out where your needs exist, all the way through a housing construction process to closing that out and rinse and repeating it. And all that should be based on, your outreach needs to be based on your needs assessment, figuring out who you're going to serve, how you're going to make them eligible. And then you have to have some sort of event where you are managing your expectations with your disaster survivors. We call that a signing event, basically a contractual arrangement that says, I'm going to do this for you, and this is all I'm going to do for you. A lot of folks kind of grew up in the HGTV, Move That Bus era, where we think the government's here to help, or somebody's giving me a free house, so I'm going to get all the bells and whistles. It's absolutely critical that you are managing expectations of this is what I'm going to provide for you, something that is safe, sanitary, and secure, decent housing for you to live in. And you have to have a robust finance audit and closeout function because they're going to make your process more transparent, which is going to hopefully lead to you receiving more funding in the future. So here's a bit of an approach when designing your strategy. You can try to have a culture of compliance or a culture of commitment. Compliance is more of an extrinsic. Forces are bearing on you to do the right thing. I have to do this because it's what required of me. Or you can have a culture of commitment, which is we're working to do this because it's what we want to do. It's an intrinsic value. You have to have both to have a successful operation. You have to have some sort of rigid compliance framework, but ultimately you want to have folks who are motivated to recover your community. So here's a little strategy 101. It's basically using your means and your ways to get to a particular end state. When planning your recovery strategy, start with the end in mind. What does a recovered community look like for me, whether that's focusing on housing or infrastructure, whatever the needs might be? Do we know what the end looks like? Can we describe the end to someone else? What means are we going to have available to us? Means are typically going to be money, people, and time. When you talk about the ways, how are we going to get there? What is it that we're going to do with those means to solve our problem? Is our solution going to be feasible? Is it going to be worth it? You don't want to go throwing a bunch of money at a problem and then realize it could have been better used somewhere else. Do our ways meet the spirit and intent of our recovery process? And this is a nice little motivational quote from my boss who couldn't be here. But if you're interested to do whatever's convenient, if you're committed, you'll do whatever it takes. He spent about 30 years in the Army saying fancy things like this. It's been very motivating for me. So, what questions do you have about developing a recovery strategy or the anatomy of the disaster that haven't already been asked? Yes? Oh, that's not a question that I can answer, but hopefully Angela can.
If not tonight, tomorrow. And we'll also be, I'll announce it when we're all done, but I'm going to also send out a survey for feedback too. So that'll all be wrapped up nicely in an email, if not tonight, tomorrow.
And will that include each of your contact informations?
Yeah, certainly. And we'll see if the recording is ready by then too. Maybe we can include that if you want to go back and re-listen to all of it. But I'll come up and make a more formal announcement so we can get it for the folks on Zoom too. But any questions for Joe while we have him?
Oh, I'm not going anywhere yet, y'all. We still got time. So we're going to, go ahead.
Another $20 sandwich tonight, huh?
Yeah. Well, and hopefully they didn't take away those yet, because I'm going to save myself $20 and.
No sandwiches.
No. We're going to In-N-Out Burger. That's what we have resolved to do this evening as folks who aren't from here. I love Shake Shack. I didn't know that was an option.
We have Shake Shack in New York now.
All right, so now we're going to talk about creating a long-term recovery group while I contemplate which burger I'm going to be eating tonight. All right, so here's the national definition of what a long-term recovery group is, and we briefly touched on it before, but it's basically just a group of interested individuals from a variety of different backgrounds, occupations, areas within a community who are working together to recover the community from a disaster. There is no real right or wrong answer on what the structure needs to look like. They vary depending on what the type of disaster you have, what resources you have available, who all's active in the community. But generally they reflect the local needs, the resources, cultural diversity, leadership style, and community support of the impacted community. But the key points that we're going to really focus on, cooperative body. It's folks who are generally trying to work together. If you have a situation where your long-term recovery group's meeting and everybody's just arguing about stuff that doesn't matter, that is not a cooperative body. You need to reevaluate what it is you're doing there. Ultimately working to assist those individuals and families in your community who have been impacted from a disaster to recover from that disaster. So, the second bullet here is very, very important because your long-term recovery group is going to need money to be able to function. And if you can offer a tax incentive to those people who are giving you money, you will have a much higher likelihood of them giving money to you. So being or having a fiscal agent that establishes your organization as exempt under 501c3 of the tax code, meaning you're a nonprofit organization that can give people a receipt for their donations, is critical to the success of your long-term recovery group. You do not have to be that, you don't have to get that formal designation yourself as an organization as long as you have some other nonprofit foundation that can serve as a pass-through for your funding so that folks can donate the money to that foundation. The foundation then provides that funding support to you. Yes, ma'am.
And I'll tell you that the local VOAD is a 501c3 as well as the Northern California Community Foundations have an emergency fund, and they give that money to the organizations that are working the disaster. So there's like a one-stop shop. It's not that, well, that's what they told me here. So, yeah, so that, but we would also work with the community foundation to get funding in as well as those donations.
Great.
Earmarked for here.
And you have to be, the last thing to be mindful of is that you are responsible to those folks who give you money to provide positive outcomes. So don't just be an organization that all your sole source, the sole reason you are funded is just to exist. You actually need to be producing outcomes for your donors and for your disaster impacted citizens. Here's a basic organization structure that I'm going to talk about here today. You basically have an executive committee. These are going to be all your community stakeholders who are going to meet and kind of establish the policy for your organization. You would hopefully have a paid position of an executive director. Now, depending on the resources of your community, that might not be feasible. It may end up being a volunteer position. But then you're going to have several different functions, which we'll talk about in detail, that are critical to a long-term recovery group. That's a disaster case management function, a construction function, a communications function, warehouse or supply chain function, donation management function, as well as a fiscal function, whether that's your organization internally or working through some other fiscal agent. So your executive committee is basically just the organization that's going to be responsible for your overall strategy for your long-term recovery group. You typically want to have an odd number. Why do you want to have an odd number? You don't want a tie. You don't want a situation where you're deadlocked because you picked the wrong number of people to have on your committee. So having an odd number to make sure you don't get in that situation, because some things can get contentious. Not everyone agrees on what right looks like in the context of recovery. But they're going to be responsible for establishing the governing documents for your long-term recovery group, developing your strategy, making a decision on who is going to run the long-term recovery group through the hiring of an executive director. Hopefully, they're going to be helpful when it comes to obtaining resources and providing outreach to donors. Ideally, if you have a wealthy individual or somebody who's involved in a relatively large, relatively local corporate organization in your community, you would like to have that person as a part of your executive committee because they are going to be more likely to try to leverage those resources they have available to provide funding to your long-term recovery group. So that can help a lot when obtaining resources. So the best practice here for the executive committee that's most important is try not to get in the weeds of the day-to-day operation of the long-term recovery group. Don't micromanage your executive director, but keep a close eye on the money. Constantly monitor all your fiscal reporting, and we'll talk a bit more about that in the third block.
One thing I might recommend. Thank you. Thank you. I might recommend that you have an insurance policy to protect all your executives. I didn't see anything about protecting your executives, because since you're handling money, you can be sued personally. So my question is, do you have anything planned, within your plan, Do you have anything that protects all your directors, or your board of directors, or executive committee?
Yeah, that is an important point to make, and no, I don't really talk about that, but I will in the future, so thank you for that. Yes?
It would be, in California, like, we look for a fiscal agent to, not necessarily become your own nonprofit, because that takes forever, but, you get a fiscal agent, and that would cover all those things.
Director and officer insurance is specifically what I think he's speaking to.
Right, but
Your DNO is covered by your fiscal sponsor. So what would happen as a fiscal agent is you would be basically a standing, or not standing, acting committee and a program of that agency, which would mean your board for that is covered as committee members of that nonprofit entity under their DNO. So it's pretty precise. There's a whole national framework on fiscal sponsorship and agency that you can dig into for a deep dive, but you're usually covered. The only thing that's usually not included with those is E&O insurance. And so for that, if you need errors and omission, errors and omission is only for professional staff. So you're only talking about if you have clinicians, if you have attorneys, you have public adjusters, you have professionals working in their capacity. That's the only reason you're going to need E&O.
Right, but on all the boards I've been on, we've all been protected.
By DNO,
No.
by
I
E&O.
have personally, but I have board of directors, I have a liability insurance that covers this, because when you're handling money,
Right, but you have all of those other coverages under your fiscal sponsor agency.
yeah, because under the auspices of you're giving the money because of, or you're collecting money, and you're not using the money the way you said you're gonna use the money, there lies the liability.
Right, and when you have a fiscal sponsor, they're actually responsible for that. They have the fiduciary responsibility to do that for your board as well.
Okay, how does this get connected to you, what you're saying? So you wanna put a board together, and I got a board together like you outlined here. Where's the connection? How's the connection between?
So your long-term recovery group is just an entity. Most people have them under a VOAD if you have a VOAD. I'm sorry to derail you.
Go for it.
If you don't have a VOAD,
Yeah.
and you don't have a fiscal sponsor for your VOAD, you're gonna ask one of your partner agencies to be the fiscal sponsor, because as Val Mahatovich said, it might take you 6 months to a year to get your IRS paperwork approved. You need to be taking donations now and helping people. So there's a website by the National Association of Community Foundations that outlines the responsibilities and models for fiduciary agencies taking fiduciary responsibility for nonprofit purpose. There's 3 models, ABC, and so that entity would take one of those models, you would have an agreement, there's sample forms on there, you can borrow a contract, and you can set up your long-term recovery group with its elected board, elected by the membership, will basically do a resolution that agency, nonprofit's board will approve, that will make you a program under them. And
So it's a board that approves it, that's like an.
your board would put a request into their nonprofit, their board would have to adopt it. That's how you're
That's what I
in.
was trying to get. Okay.
Yeah, I know it's technical, sorry.
Yeah, I got it.
So that's how you make sure your folks don't get sued if they misspend the
Well,
funds.
If the point of the insurance is if you do get sued, are you covered? And I want to be covered personally, not just as a board member.
So now we'll talk about the kind of the roles and responsibilities of an executive director. In conjunction with that executive board, they're responsible for the development of the strategy. They need to be responsible for figuring out what the staffing needs are going to be for the long-term recovery group. This can be paid or volunteer staffing positions. Developing the systems that you're going to need to execute whatever activity it is you're contemplating as a long-term recovery group. Having policy that governs what you're going to do and who you're going to do it for. They're responsible for day-to-day leadership. They're ultimately responsible to the board for fiscal accountability. And they really need to be the face of the long-term recovery group who is coordinating directly with all of the outside stakeholders. So that's your elected officials, any emergency management staff, your corporate donors potentially, as well as disaster-impacted survivors. Best practices for this, if you have the funding, somebody's going to be more willing to work a lot harder if you're paying them to do it than if it's a volunteer position. They really need to work to coordinate the staff and the volunteers and more importantly, keep the board informed of the activities so that the board can go out there and do more storytelling to raise more money to keep your mission progressing forward. And they need to drive policy and make sure everyone's adhering to that policy. The most critical policy that I think that your executive director can work to establish is your eligibility policy, because you will have limited resources. You're always going to have this much disaster, this much money. So figuring out who you're going to serve is the most critical function of the executive director from a policy perspective. And that should be based on the wishes of the board, the needs of the community, the unmet needs assessment that you'll likely have to do for many of your funding sources. So the first major function I want to talk about is the disaster case management function. This is going to be your outreach. This is going to be really kind of the boots on the ground face of your long-term recovery group. And you really need to have people who are going to go sit with your clients and work with them to develop what's called an individual recovery plan, establishing what their needs are for recovery, not necessarily what their wants are. Because oftentimes folks are going to want a lot more than it is you can provide for them. So managing those expectations at the beginning of the process is a critical function of disaster case management. But they basically need to be the people that hold the hands of your survivor from day one until recovery, or you pass them off to another resource. The second critical function is going to be construction management. And the construction function should coordinate closely with disaster case management. Case management passes off eligible applicants who are then moving on to your construction process. Figuring out what the scope of work looks like is important here in this process. So having some established policy for what it is you're going to repair, what you're not going to repair. Oftentimes, particularly when you're focusing on low to moderate income households, there's a lot of deferred maintenance issues. So it may not necessarily be direct disaster damage, but there's a lot of stuff that's gone wrong in a household that you could repair if you had the funding, but it's up to you from a policy perspective to decide whether or not you're only going to address disaster impacts or you're going to address all the needs of the household. Do you have a question, sir? Or you were just, okay. Construction function has to focus on controlling costs as well as managing a change order process for anyone who's ever undertaken a housing repair and had that initial scope of work. Inevitably, there will be change orders associated with it when you have a disaster impacted home. So being mindful of that and having a strong process for navigating that is a critical function. And make sure that we are complying with local codes, something that I'm sure is not unfamiliar to the folks here who have ever done any sort of work in California. Complying with government regulations is a critical function of the construction function. So the communications piece of a long-term recovery group is absolutely critical. I like to say that, this is where storytelling is key. The ability of your communications function to talk about the needs that remain in the community as well as the successes that you're having in working to repair that community can do wonders for getting additional funding for you, because success breeds more success. So if you're focused on having a robust communication function that's particularly adept at the art of storytelling, you're likely to get a lot more money flowing into your program. So you're going to get a lot of stuff and you got to have somewhere to put it, right? Having a function for storing supplies until you can adequately distribute them to the community is a critical component of a long-term recovery group. You need to be judicious in distributing those things as soon as you get them, or figuring out somewhere for them to go. You don't want to be on the news 6 months from now because you discover that you have a warehouse full of water that was donated in the aftermath of the disaster that you didn't do anything with. So keep staying on top of your supply function is important for maintaining the credibility of your long-term recovery group. And this point kind of flows into that as well with the donation management function. People are going to donate a lot of stuff, and you're probably not going to need most of it, but hopefully there will be somebody else who will need it. So while you you should actively work to go get donations of goods and materials, ideally you want money because you have a lot more flexibility with that. But you need to make sure that you're coordinating closely with your fiscal agent in terms of the financial resources that are donated to you.
I would add critically to get a real clear picture of what the needs are of the people, so you don't have all this excess.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of people will donate stuff that isn't even good for garbage.
Yep.
I've seen disasters where there's truckloads of bales of stuff ready to go to the dump.
Yeah, so they get to feel good like they helped to contribute, but all they were doing was some spring cleaning.
Yep.
Yeah, that happens a lot. And then you look like the bad guy because you're throwing away all these donated goods, right? But it's, yeah, so having a standard for what you want to accept and having somebody who is ensuring that what you're receiving meets that standard is a critical function of donation management. And finally, your fiscal function. This is what's going to help to ultimately protect your reputation. Depending on how you're established, will determine what this function needs to look like from a staffing perspective. If you're working through someone else as a fiscal agent, you may need nothing more than somebody to make requests for funding from that organization. If not, you may have to have a robust process, which we'll talk about a bit more in the financing, the long-term recovery group portion. So that's kind of what the organization could look like. Here's how it all should work in a perfect world if you have that particular structure, which is a bit of a rehash of what we talked about. But basically, your first step is that your executive committee is going to go after the money. They're going to seek donations and then feed that into your donation management function. Step 2 is that they're going to get that money and it's going to either feed into your warehouse function or your fiscal function for your budget, which we'll talk about in the financing portion. While that's happening, your disaster case management function is going to be coordinating with your clients who have particular needs, who will then work to determine if they are eligible based on policy established by your governing board and your executive director. Once they determine that, they will then brief that information to the director, who will make a decision ensuring that this person truly has a need. We know what the estimated cost to repair is. We've decided that this person is someone we should assist, and we have the resources available to assist them. They will then get fed to the construction process, and then the construction process will basically work to see if we need to contract this out or we have volunteer resources to help to address this particular need of this particular client. While all this is happening, your communications function is working to document this and tell that story so that you can feed it back to your executive committee, who will then feed it back to the donor to show them that, hey, look, we're spending the money on what we told you we were going to spend the money on. Give us some more money. Once that's complete, you're going to constantly want to be looking to refine your processes. So having that feedback in step 7 is important to see, are there ways that we can improve our process, be more efficient with our resources, and then go back and go get some more money. It's all about the money.